The sun hung low over the Philippine Sea on the morning of July 2, 1944, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful for war. But war had come to these waters nonetheless, and with it a young man from the cornfields of Iowa who would change the nature of aerial combat forever. His name was Lieutenant James Howard McCampbell, though everyone called him Mac. 23 years old, fresh-faced, with calloused hands that still remembered the feel of a plow handle better than a control stick. Just 18 months earlier, he'd been driving a tractor across endless rows of corn under the wide Nebraska sky. Now he sat in the cramped cockpit of a Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter 30,000 feet above an ocean that stretched to infinity in every direction. Mac wasn't supposed to be here. None of the farm boys were. But when the call came after Pearl Harbor, when the nation needed pilots to push back against the advancing tide of the Japanese Empire, thousands of young men from America's heartland answered. They brought with them something the military academies couldn't teach, an intimate understanding of machinery, weather, and the patient observation that comes from working the land. The Pacific Theater in July 1944 was a crucible of innovation and desperation. The American advance across the Central Pacific had been grinding forward, island by island, at tremendous cost. The Japanese Navy, still formidable despite losses at Midway and the Solomon Islands, was making its stand. And in the skies above these contested waters, pilots on both sides were locked in a deadly dance that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and ingenuity. But to understand how one farm boy's observation would change everything, we need to go back 6 months earlier, to a frozen airfield in California, where Mac first encountered the problem that would consume him. January 1944, Naval Air Station, Lemoore, California. The winter wind cut across the runway with a bite that reminded Mac of home, though the landscape here was flat and brown instead of white with snow. He'd completed his basic flight training and was now undergoing advanced combat preparation, learning the brutal realities of air-to-air combat from instructors who'd survived the early campaigns in the Pacific. The lecture hall was crowded with young pilots, their leather jackets creaking as they leaned forward to study the tactical diagrams projected on the screen. The instructor, a grizzled veteran named Commander Robert Dixon, had flown at Coral Sea. His voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "Gentlemen, the Zero is faster, more maneuverable, and can outturn anything we've got," Dixon said, his pointer tapping against a silhouette of the Japanese fighter. "In a turning fight, you're finished. The Japanese pilot has been training since before most of you could drive. He knows his aircraft intimately, and he's not afraid to use it." Dixon paused, letting the words sink in. "Our advantage is durability, firepower, and teamwork. The Hellcat can take punishment that would tear a Zero apart. Your 650 caliber machine guns can end a fight in seconds if you get a clean shot. And most importantly, you never, ever fight alone." Mac raised his hand. The instructor nodded at him. "Sir, what if the wingman separation gets too wide? What if you lose visual contact in clouds or during high-G maneuvers?" Dixon's expression darkened. "Then you've already made a fatal mistake, Lieutenant. Separation beyond 200 yards means you can't support each other. And once you're alone up there," he didn't need to finish the sentence. That night, Mac lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The tactical problem gnawed at him with the same persistent attention he'd once applied to fixing a broken harvester. The thatch weave, the defensive maneuver that had saved countless American pilots, worked brilliantly when both pilots maintained visual contact and executed the scissors pattern perfectly. But combat wasn't perfect. Radios failed. Smoke and clouds obscured vision. Pilots got disoriented in the chaos of a furball engagement. What they needed was a way to maintain mutual support even when they couldn't see each other. A way to turn the Japanese advantage in maneuverability into a trap. Mac pulled out a notebook and began sketching, his engineer's mind working through the problem like it was a mechanical puzzle. If you couldn't see your wingman, you needed predictability. You needed to know where he would be without looking. You needed The pencil paused on the paper as an idea began to form. By March, Mac had been assigned to Fighting Squadron 15, part of the legendary Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex. The carrier was preparing for deployment to the forward areas, participating in the great offensive that would drive toward the Philippines and eventually Japan itself. Mac's squadron commander was Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, no relation, despite the similar name. David McCampbell would go on to become the Navy's top ace. But in March 1944, he was simply a skilled leader who recognized talent when he saw it. "You've been spending a lot of time in the ready room after hours," McCampbell observed one evening, finding Mac surrounded by charts and diagrams. "What are you working on?" Mac hesitated, then decided to share his thinking. "Sir, I've been studying the engagement reports from Tarawa and Kwajalein. Most of our losses happen when element integrity breaks down. A pilot gets separated, and suddenly he's alone against multiple zeros. That's not new information, Lieutenant." "No, sir. But I think there's a solution we haven't tried." Mac spread out his diagrams. "What if instead of trying to maintain constant visual contact, we use altitude separation and timing?" McCampbell leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on." "The Hellcat has better power-to-weight ratio at altitude than the Zero and better energy retention in a dive. If we stack our element vertically instead of horizontally, with the lead at medium altitude and the wingman 2,000 feet above and offset, we create a trap." Mac's finger traced the paths on his diagram. "When bogies engage the lead, they fixate on him. That's human nature. The lead initiates a climbing turn, not to evade, but to slow down and draw them up. The wingman, who's been maintaining a lazy circle above, has clear sight lines and perfect positioning for a diving attack. They're focused on the climb, not looking up and behind," McCampbell murmured, studying the diagram. "And when your wingman dives, he's got 4 to 5 seconds of firing solution before they even know he's there. And because he's diving, he's got all the speed he needs to break off and climb back to altitude before they can react. Then the roles reverse. The original lead becomes the high man, and the wingman becomes the bait." McCampbell was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving over the calculations. "It's aggressive, probably too aggressive for the tactics board to approve." "Yes, sir. Which is why we're not going to tell them until after we've proven it works." McCampbell looked up, a slight smile on his weathered face. "Find yourself a wingman you trust, Lieutenant. Someone steady. You're going to need a lot of practice before we try this for real." Boss, Mac chose Ensign Roy Rushing, a lanky pilot from Texas who flew with the calm precision of someone who'd grown up handling volatile machinery on oil rigs. They spent every available hour practicing the maneuver, first over the California coast, then during the Essex's shakedown cruise toward Pearl Harbor. The key was the timing. Too early, and the high man would miss his diving attack. Too late, and the lead would be in real danger. They developed hand signals and radio brevity codes, practiced until the maneuver became instinctive. Other pilots in the squadron watched with curiosity, some with skepticism. "You're going to get yourselves written up," warned Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Outlaw, another of the squadron's more experienced pilots. "The tactical doctrine is clear. Mutual support means staying together, not splitting up vertically." "We're not splitting up," Mac replied. "We're just defining together differently." By the time the Essex reached Pearl Harbor in late April, Mac and Roy had refined the maneuver dozens of times. But theory and practice over friendly skies were one thing. Combat would be something else entirely. The Pacific in the spring of 1944 was a theater in transition. The great carrier battles that had defined the first 2 years of the war, massive fleet engagements like Midway and the Philippine Sea, were giving way to a new kind of warfare. The American industrial machine was producing carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots at a rate the Japanese couldn't hope to match. But the Japanese defenders were becoming increasingly desperate, increasingly willing to accept any exchange ratio that slowed the American advance. For the pilots, this meant every mission carried the weight of knowing that somewhere out there, an enemy pilot was calculating angles, conserving ammunition, looking for any mistake that would even the odds. The Essex joined Task Force 58 in early May, participating in strikes against Marcus Island and Wake Island, shaking down the air group in live combat conditions. Mack flew his first combat missions during these operations, mostly escorting bombers and conducting fighter sweeps over Japanese installations. The enemy air opposition was light, mostly older aircraft flown by less experienced pilots. But even these engagements taught valuable lessons. Mack noticed how the Japanese pilots, even when clearly outmatched, would often commit to attacks with a ferocity that bordered on recklessness. They seemed less concerned with survival than with inflicting damage, a cultural mindset that was both admirable and terrifying. "They're not trying to win dogfights," McCampbell explained during a post-mission debrief. "They're trying to prevent us from winning. Every minute they keep us engaged is a minute we're not bombing their ships or installations. It's a delaying action, and they're willing to pay any price for it." This observation would prove crucial in the weeks to come. June brought the Marianas Campaign, a massive operation to seize Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands that would bring American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Navy, recognizing the existential threat this posed, committed to a decisive fleet action that would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19th, the largest carrier air battle of the war erupted over the waters west of Guam. More than 400 Japanese aircraft launched in waves against the American fleet, and American fighters rose to meet them in what would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Mack's squadron was among the first airborne vectored toward the incoming raid by radar operators aboard the ships below. The radio crackled with controlled urgency as the fighter director officer called out bearings and ranges. Vector 270, Angels 18. Large raid inbound, estimate 70-plus bandits. Mack's throat was dry despite the water he'd drunk before launch. This was it, the real test. Below him, stretching across the ocean, dozens of Hellcats were climbing to intercept, an aerial armada rising to meet the threat. At 16,000 feet, they made contact. The Japanese formation emerged from the haze like a swarm, a mixture of Zeros, Vals, and Judys heading toward the fleet. Mack's section leader called out assignments, and suddenly the sky erupted into chaos. Tracers arced through the air in every direction. Aircraft rolled and turned, climbed and dove, each pilot fighting for position, for advantage, for survival. Mack locked onto a Zero that was diving toward a group of dauntless dive bombers, squeezed off a burst, and watched his tracers walk up toward the enemy fighter. The Zero jinked left, and Mack followed, his G-suit inflating as he pulled hard into the turn. The Japanese pilot was good, maintaining his defensive turn while gradually working lower, trying to use his superior turn radius to reverse the situation. This was where Mack's training took over. Instead of trying to match the Zero's turn, he used his superior power to pull up, converting speed into altitude, then rolled inverted and pulled through, coming down on the Zero from above. The diving attack gave him just enough closure rate to get a firing solution, and his 650 calibers hammered out a 2-second burst that tore through the Zero's wing root. The Japanese fighter broke apart, pieces tumbling toward the ocean far below. Mack didn't watch it fall. Already he was scanning for threats, for wingmen, for the next engagement. The battle raged for nearly 3 hours. When it was over, the Japanese had lost more than 250 aircraft, while American losses numbered fewer than 30. It was a catastrophic defeat for Japanese naval aviation, one from which they would never recover. But Mack had noticed something during the battle, something that nagged at him during the long flight back to the Essex. Several times, he'd found himself in situations where the tactical doctrine broke down. Wingmen got separated in the chaos. Radio calls were stepped on or garbled. Pilots found themselves suddenly alone, forced to rely on individual skill rather than mutual support. The vertical separation tactic he'd been developing might have helped, but there hadn't been time to implement it properly. The battle had been too fluid, too chaotic. That night, as the Essex steamed through darkened waters, Mack sat in the ready room with Roy Rushing and several other pilots replaying the day's engagements. "The problem is the initial merge," Mack said, gesturing with his hands. Once you're in the furball, everything breaks down. You can't maintain element integrity when there are 50 aircraft in a 5-mile radius, all trying to engage each other. So what's the solution? Roy asked. You can't avoid the merge. That's where the fight happens. Maybe you can, Mac said slowly, an idea forming. What if the goal isn't to join the furball, but to control it from outside? What if we position ourselves at altitude before the merge, and instead of diving in and mixing it up, we stay high and pick off targets as they're engaged with other friendlies? Another pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade James Swope, shook his head. That's not supporting your squadron mates. That's cherry-picking. Is it? Mac challenged. Think about it. When you're in a turning fight with a zero, what's the most dangerous moment? When you're reversing? When you're slow and predictable, Swope admitted. Exactly. That's when you need help the most. But your wingman can't help because he's probably in his own turning fight 50 yards away. But if there's a section at altitude watching the whole battle, they can dive on any zero that's about to get a killing shot. They're not cherry-picking, they're providing top cover. The pilots fell silent, considering this. It was contrary to everything they'd been taught about aggressive engagement, but it also made a certain kind of sense. Commander McCampbell, who'd been listening from the doorway, spoke up. It would require discipline, a lot of discipline. The instinct is to dive in and join the fight, not to circle overhead. Yes, sir, Mac agreed, but it would also require the low section to trust that the high section is there, watching. That's why it needs to be practiced, coordinated. We've got time, McCampbell said. The next big operation won't be for a few weeks. I want you to work up a detailed tactical plan, present it to the squadron. If the pilots buy in, we'll drill it. And if it works, we'll have something to bring to the Fighter Tactics Board. July 1944 arrived with humid heat that turned the Essex's flight deck into a griddle. The carrier was operating southeast of the Philippines, supporting General MacArthur's push toward Leyte Gulf. Daily strikes against Japanese airfields and installations had become routine, but intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese were massing aircraft for a major counteroffensive. Air Group 15 had been flying near continuous missions for 2 weeks. The pilots were exhausted, subsisting on coffee and nervous energy, but the pace of operations allowed no rest. Every day brought more sorties, more hours strapped into a cockpit, more moments of terror compressed into confusion and violence. Mac's vertical separation tactic had been cautiously embraced by the squadron. They'd practiced it during combat air patrol missions, refined the hand signals and radio procedures, but they hadn't yet had the opportunity to employ it in a major engagement. That opportunity came on the morning of July the 2nd. The day began like any other, with pre-dawn launches sending fighter sweeps toward Japanese-held airfields on Mindanao. Mac was scheduled for the second launch, a combat air patrol that would orbit the task force and respond to any incoming raids. He was in the ready room, going over charts and checking the weather brief, when the loudspeaker crackled to life. Pilots, man your aircraft. Launch fighter squadron immediately. This is not a drill. The scramble alarm. Mac's heart rate instantly doubled as he grabbed his flight gear and ran for the flight deck. Around him, other pilots were doing the same, the well-practiced chaos of a carrier preparing for action. On the flight deck, plane handlers were already positioning Hellcats on the catapults. Mac reached his assigned aircraft, number 13, and climbed into the cockpit with practiced efficiency. His plane captain helped him strap in while shouting over the roar of engines. "Big raid inbound, sir. Radar's painting 50-plus contacts." Mac gave him a thumbs up, his hands already moving through the pre-flight checklist. Oil pressure good. Fuel sufficient for 2 hours. Guns charged. Ammunition counters showing full belts. The launch was controlled chaos, aircraft being flung off the deck every 30 seconds. Mac's stomach dropped as his Hellcat was shot forward by the catapult, the acceleration pressing him back into his seat. Then he was airborne, gear retracting, already climbing and turning to join the forming squadron. The fighter director's voice came over the radio, crisp and urgent. Vector 295, Angels 22. Raid consists of multiple elements. Estimate 60 bandits. Range 40 miles and closing. Mac glanced at Roy, flying in formation off his wing. Through the canopy, he could see the other pilot's face, calm and focused. They'd discussed this scenario dozens of times. Now they'd find out if their theory worked in practice. Squadron Commander McCampbell's voice came over the squadron frequency. "All fabled units, this is Fable Leader. We're going to execute Tactic 7. Acknowledge." One by one, the section leaders called in their acknowledgement. Tactic 7 was their designation for the vertical separation defense. Half the squadron would engage at medium altitude, while the other half would position high and dive in to support. Mac and Roy were assigned to the high section along with two other pairs. They climbed through 20,000 feet, then 25, breaking through a scattered cloud layer into brilliant sunlight. Below, the ocean sparkled like hammered metal, and Mac could see the wakes of the task force ships stretching across the water in perfect formation. "Tally-ho! Bandits at our 11 o'clock! Level!" The call came from one of the low-section leaders. Mac snapped his head left and spotted them. A formation of Japanese aircraft approaching from the west stepped up in altitude from 10,000 to 18,000 feet. They were heading directly for the fleet. The low section positioned themselves between the raid and the ships, spread out in a defensive line at 16,000 feet. Mac watched as the Japanese formation began to split, some elements diving toward the ships, others moving to engage the American fighters. "High section, maintain altitude and spacing," McCampbell ordered. "Wait for the merge." It was harder than it sounded. Every instinct screamed to dive down and join the fight, to support their squadron mates who were about to face overwhelming numbers. But Mac held his position, trusting the plan, watching the tactical picture develop below. The merge happened at 14,000 feet, a controlled collision of two opposing forces. Suddenly the sky was full of aircraft turning, diving, climbing, each pilot seeking advantage. Tracers laced through the air. Black smoke trails marked aircraft that had taken damage. Mac counted to 5, then keyed his radio. Tactic break, tactic break. High section attacking now. He rolled his Hellcat inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, Roy staying with him in perfect formation. The dive built their speed rapidly. 400 knots, 420, 440. The wind screamed over the canopy and the G-forces built as Mac began his pullout, his sights tracking onto a Zero that was pursuing one of the low-section Hellcats through a climbing turn. The Japanese pilot never saw him coming. Mac's 6 guns hammered out a 3-second burst, and the Zero disintegrated, its pilot never knowing what had ended the engagement. Mac pulled back up to altitude, his energy allowing him to zoom climb back above the fight. "One splashed," he reported, already scanning for the next opportunity. What followed was unlike any air combat the squadron had experienced before. Instead of a confused furball, where everyone mixed it up at the same altitude, the battle developed vertical separation. The low section kept the Japanese fighters engaged, turning and reversing, while the high section repeatedly dove through the fight, picking off enemy aircraft that were focused on other targets. The Japanese pilots quickly realized something was wrong, but they couldn't adjust their tactics. If they tried to climb to engage the high section, they exposed themselves to the low section. If they stayed engaged with the low section, they were vulnerable to diving attacks from above. It was a trap with no escape, and Mac had helped design it. Over the next 20 minutes, Mac made 4 diving attacks, each time using his speed advantage to engage, fire, and climb back to altitude before the enemy could respond. Roy covered him on each dive, timing his attacks to complement Mac's, ensuring they were never both low at the same time. The squadron radio frequency was organized chaos, pilots calling out threats and tallies, confirming splashes, maintaining situational awareness. But unlike previous major engagements, there were no calls of help needed or breaking off. The tactical advantage was too overwhelming. When the last Japanese aircraft broke off and fled toward the west, trailing smoke, the sky suddenly felt empty and quiet despite the roar of Mac's engine. He did a slow turn, scanning for any lingering threats, but there was nothing. Just Hellcats reforming into sections, checking their fuel states. preparing for the flight back to the Essex. The tally was stunning. The squadron had engaged approximately 60 Japanese aircraft and had accounted for 42 confirmed destroyed, with several more probables. American losses were 0. Not a single pilot had been forced to ditch or bail out. The worst damage was some cannon holes in one Hellcat's wing, easily repairable. It was unprecedented. The intelligence officers were waiting in the ready room when the pilots returned. They took detailed statements from each pilot, mapping out the engagement, analyzing what had worked and why. By evening, word of the one-sided victory had spread throughout the task force. That night, Admiral Mark Mitscher, commander of Task Force 58, came aboard the Essex to speak with the squadron personally. The grizzled admiral, who'd been flying and fighting since before most of the pilots were born, listened intently as McCampbell explained the tactics. "Lieutenant," Mitscher said, turning to Mac, "I understand this was your idea." "The refinement was mine, sir," Mac replied carefully. "But it built on existing tactical doctrine and the experience of many pilots." Mitscher smiled slightly. "Appropriately modest, but the fact remains you identified a problem and developed a solution, one that appears to be remarkably effective." He paused, looking around the ready room at the assembled pilots. "I'm authorizing immediate dissemination of this tactical approach to all fighter squadrons in the task force. It will be formally designated as the McCampbell Defense, after both your commander and yourself." Mac felt his face flush. "Sir, that's not necessary." "It's necessary if we want to save lives," Mitscher said firmly. "This isn't about glory, Lieutenant. This is about giving every pilot in this theater the best chance of coming home. The Japanese are getting desperate, and desperate enemies are dangerous. We need every advantage we can get." Over the following weeks, the tactic was refined and taught throughout the fleet. Fighter tactics instructors flew out from Pearl Harbor to observe and train squadrons in the new approach. Combat reports from other carriers began to show similar success rates when the vertical separation defense was employed properly. The Japanese, for their part, struggled to adapt. Their tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive individual combat, the spirit of the warrior seeking one-on-one duels in the sky. The McCampbell Defense turned this cultural preference into a liability, using their own aggression against them. But the real genius of the tactic wasn't just the vertical separation or the timing. It was the way it transformed the nature of the fight. Instead of 50 individual duels happening simultaneously, it created a coordinated defense where every American pilot had support, even if they couldn't see their wingman. The farm boy's observation about predictability and positioning had evolved into a systematic approach that redefined fighter tactics for the rest of the war. Mac flew 72 more combat missions over the next 6 months, participating in the campaigns for Leyte, Gulf, Iwo Jima, and eventually the strikes against the Japanese home islands. He was credited with destroying 14 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, a respectable but not exceptional total for a skilled pilot. What made Mac's contribution exceptional wasn't his individual score, but the lives he saved through tactical innovation. Conservative estimates suggest that the McCampbell Defense and its variations accounted for improved kill ratios that saved hundreds of American pilots' lives over the final year of the Pacific War. After the war, Mac returned to Nebraska, to the farm and the endless fields of corn. He rarely talked about his wartime experience, uncomfortable with the attention and recognition. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross for his actions on July 2nd and several subsequent engagements, but the medal went into a drawer, rarely shown to visitors. When aviation historians tracked him down in the 1960s trying to document the evolution of fighter tactics, Mac was characteristically modest. "I just tried to solve a problem the same way I'd approach fixing a broken tractor," he said. "You look at what's not working, you think about the mechanics of it, and you try something different. That's all." But it was more than that. Mac had brought a different kind of thinking to aerial combat, one rooted in engineering principles and systematic observation rather than the romantic notions of individual heroism that had dominated early fighter doctrine. He'd recognized that winning wasn't about being a better individual pilot, It was about creating tactical situations where your side had systematic advantages. This mindset, the idea that warfare could be approached as a problem-solving exercise rather than a test of courage, would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. From the energy maneuverability theory that shaped fighter design in the 1970s to the network-centric warfare concepts of the 21st century, the underlying principle remained the same. Systematic advantage trumps individual skill. The summer of 1944 in the Pacific was a turning point in many ways. The Marianas Campaign gave America the bases needed to begin strategic bombing of Japan. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. And in the skies above those contested waters, young men like Mack were rewriting the rules of aerial combat, learning that innovation could be just as important as courage. But the war was far from over. The Japanese, though increasingly desperate, would fight with undiminished ferocity for another year. New threats would emerge, including the organized self-sacrifice attacks that would exact a terrible toll on the American fleet. And the skies over Japan itself would prove to be among the most dangerous of the entire conflict. For Mack and his squadron mates, the next months would bring some of their most difficult missions: strikes against heavily defended targets, long-range escort missions that push the limits of fuel and endurance, combat against increasingly desperate defenders who had nothing left to lose. The operation to support the Leyte Gulf landings in October brought some of the most intense air combat of the entire Pacific campaign. The Japanese Navy, making its last desperate attempt to disrupt the invasion, committed nearly its entire remaining surface fleet. The resulting battle sprawled across the Philippine archipelago, a confused series of engagements that tested the limits of American naval aviation. Air Group 15 found itself in the thick of it, flying multiple sorties per day against Japanese naval forces. Mack's section was assigned to provide combat air patrol over the escort carriers during the battle off Samar, where a Japanese surface force nearly broke through to destroy the vulnerable flat tops. The morning of October 25th dawned gray and ominous, with low clouds and intermittent rain squalls. Mack launched before sunrise, part of a standing combat air patrol that would orbit the carriers in shifts, providing continuous protection against air attack. They'd been airborne for 90 minutes when the call came. All fighters, surface action to the north. Japanese battleships approaching escort carrier group. Provide support as able. Mack exchanged glances with Roy through their canopies. They were fighter pilots armed with .50 caliber machine guns designed for air-to-air combat. Against battleships, their weapons would be largely ineffective, but orders were orders, and their fellow Americans were in danger. They dove through the cloud layer and emerged into a scene of organized chaos. Below, destroyers and destroyer escorts were making torpedo runs against a Japanese force that included battleships and heavy cruisers. The small American ships were outgunned by orders of magnitude, but they pressed their attacks with desperate courage, trying to buy time for the carriers to escape. Mack couldn't do much damage to battleships with machine gun fire, but he could harass them, force them to take evasive action, distract their fire control. He made repeated strafing runs along the length of a heavy cruiser, his bullets sparking harmlessly off armored decks, but forcing the ship to maneuver, disrupting its firing solution against the American destroyers. It was frustrating, feeling useless, despite being in the middle of a major battle. But the distraction worked. Combined with the destroyer attacks and the unexpected ferocity of the American resistance, the Japanese commander lost his nerve and withdrew. The escort carriers escaped, though several destroyers paid a terrible price. Flying back to the Essex that afternoon, low on fuel and ammunition, Mack reflected on the randomness of war. They'd spent months developing sophisticated fighter tactics, preparing for massive aerial engagements, only to find themselves desperately trying to fight battleships with machine guns. War had a way of making all your preparations seem inadequate. November brought new challenges as the air group supported operations in the Philippines. and began ranging further north toward Formosa and the Japanese home islands. The distances involved were staggering, pushing the Hellcat's combat radius to its limits. Pilots learned to operate in a constant state of fuel anxiety, calculating and recalculating their return margins, knowing that a miscalculation could mean a long swim in shark-infested waters. The Japanese air opposition had changed character. The elite pilots who'd opened the war were largely gone, lost in the meat grinder of 3 years of conflict. Their replacements were less skilled, but no less determined, and increasingly they employed tactics that suggested they didn't expect to survive their missions. In December, Mac's squadron encountered the first organized deployment of these tactics during a strike against Japanese airfields on Luzon. They were escorting a formation of bombers when approximately 20 Japanese fighters rose to intercept. But instead of engaging the escorts, the Japanese fighters ignored the Hellcats entirely, diving directly at the bombers with single-minded focus. The American pilots dove to intercept, but several Japanese fighters got through, crashing deliberately into the bomber formation. 3 Avengers were destroyed in the space of 30 seconds, their crews having no time to evade or defend themselves. It was a new kind of warfare, one that rejected all the traditional conventions of aerial combat. These weren't pilots looking to survive the engagement. They were weapons, using their aircraft as guided missiles in a desperate attempt to even the odds. The tactic worked precisely because it was so contrary to human instinct. Pilots on both sides were trained to survive, to press attacks, but also to break off when the situation became untenable. The willingness to sacrifice oneself without hesitation gave an enormous tactical advantage, at least until opposing fighters adjusted their tactics. Mac's squadron adapted, positioning themselves closer to the bomber formations, focusing on early interception before the attackers could begin their final dives. But it was a grim adjustment, a recognition that the enemy's desperation had reached a level that made conventional tactical responses inadequate. January 1945 brought Air Group 15 back to the forward areas after a brief rest period at Ulithi Atoll. The Essex was now part of the massive fleet assembling for the invasion of Iwo Jima, a volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Japan that would provide emergency landing fields for damaged B-29s returning from bombing runs. The pre-invasion strikes against Iwo Jima were some of the most intense Mac had experienced. The island was honeycomb with defenses, anti-aircraft positions covering every square yard of terrain. The Japanese defenders had had months to prepare, and they'd used the time well. Mac's squadron flew repeated strikes against the airfields, trying to suppress Japanese air power before the Marines landed. Each mission meant running a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, then engaging any fighters that rose to challenge them, then running the same gauntlet on the way out. The attrition rate, while not catastrophic, was steady. Pilots who'd survived months of combat were lost to a lucky burst of flak or a mechanical failure at exactly the wrong moment. The arbitrary nature of it wore on everyone. You could be the best pilot in the squadron with perfect tactical awareness and flawless execution, and still be brought down by a random shell fragment hitting a critical component. All you could do was fly your mission, execute your assignment, and hope that luck stayed with you for one more day. The invasion itself began on February 19th, and the Essex's air group spent the next month providing continuous support to the Marines fighting ashore. It was grinding, exhausting work, made worse by the knowledge that every day of combat brought new losses to the squadron, pilots and aircraft that couldn't easily be replaced this far from rear area bases. Mac flew his last combat mission of the war on March 11th, a fighter sweep over Kyushu in support of carrier strikes against Japanese airfields. It was routine, or at least as routine as any combat mission could be. They encountered moderate opposition, engaged several Japanese fighters, confirmed 2 destroyed, and returned to the Essex without losses. That night, Air Group 15 received orders to rotate back to Hawaii for rest and refit. They'd been in combat for nearly 10 months straight, one of the longest continuous deployments of any carrier air group. The pilots were exhausted, operating on momentum and muscle memory more than conscious thought. As the Essex turned eastward, leaving the combat zone behind, Mac stood on the flight deck watching the sun set over the Pacific. The ocean looked peaceful, beautiful even, with no hint of the violence that had played out across these waters for nearly 4 years. He thought about the 78 missions he'd flown, the 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, the hundreds of hours spent in a cramped cockpit over hostile territory. But mostly he thought about the pilots who weren't making this trip home, the friends and squadron mates who'd been lost along the way. War, Mac had learned, wasn't really about the victories or the tactics or the innovation. Those were just tools, means to an end. What war was really about was survival, both individual and collective. Every mission flown, every enemy aircraft destroyed, every tactical advantage gained was ultimately in service of that goal, getting yourself and your friends home alive. The vertical separation tactic, the thing that would bear his name in fighter tactics manuals, had served that purpose. It had saved lives. In the end, that was all that mattered. The war ended in August 1945 with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's subsequent surrender. Mac was still in Hawaii, preparing for what everyone expected to be the bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands. When the announcement came that Japan had surrendered, the relief was overwhelming, almost surreal. Mac was discharged in December 1945 and returned to Nebraska to find that the farm had survived the war years remarkably well. His father had kept things running, though the work had taken its toll. The old man looked 10 years older than when Mac had left. They didn't talk much about the war, at least not at first. There wasn't much to say. Mac had done his duty, survived, and come home. That was enough. The medals and the recognition seemed unimportant compared to the simple fact of being alive and back on familiar ground. But the war had changed Mac in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He approached farming with a new systematic rigor, applying the problem-solving skills he'd developed in combat to agricultural challenges. He experimented with new planting techniques, studied soil chemistry, approached the age-old work of farming with an engineer's mindset. The other veterans in the county noticed and began asking his advice. Soon, Mac found himself informally consulting for neighboring farms, helping them improve efficiency and yields. It was satisfying work, using his mind to solve problems, just in a very different context. In 1948, Mac married Alice Henderson, a teacher from a nearby town. They had 4 children over the next decade, and Mac settled into the rhythm of family life and farming. The war receded into the past, a chapter of his life that felt increasingly distant and unreal. But occasionally, on clear nights when the stars were bright overhead, Mac would stand in his fields and look up at the sky. And for just a moment, he'd remember what it felt like to be up there, at the controls of a Hellcat fighter, balanced on the knife edge between life and the alternative, part of something larger than himself. Those moments became less frequent as the years passed. Life moved forward, as it always does. The children grew up, the farm prospered, the world changed in ways both large and small. Mac's war service became just one fact among many in his biography, important but not defining. In 1972, a young Navy pilot named Jerry Houston contacted Mac after reading about the vertical separation tactic in a fighter tactics manual. Houston was part of the team developing new air combat tactics for the F-4 Phantom, and he was interested in understanding the thinking behind the original doctrine. Mac invited him to the farm, and they spent an afternoon talking about tactics and innovation. Houston was surprised by Mac's modesty, his insistence that the tactic had been a team effort, developed through trial and error rather than individual genius. But you saw the problem, Houston pressed. You recognized that the existing doctrine had limitations, and you proposed a solution. That's innovation. Mac shrugged. I just thought about it the same way I'd think about any mechanical problem. If something's not working the way it should, you figure out why and try something different. That's not special. That's just common sense. Maybe, Houston said, but common sense isn't always common, especially not in military doctrine. Most people just follow the established procedures, even when they're not optimal. Mack considered this. I suppose that's true. But I also had good leadership that was willing to try new things. Commander McCampbell could have shut me down, told me to stick to the approved tactics. Instead, he gave me the freedom to experiment. That matters just as much as the idea itself. This insight, the importance of organizational culture in fostering innovation, would influence Houston's own work on fighter tactics. The resulting doctrine, which emphasized adaptability and mission-type orders over rigid procedures, owed a debt to that afternoon conversation on a Nebraska farm. Mack passed away in 1998 at the age of 77. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and neighbors who'd known him primarily as a farmer and community member. Few of them knew the full extent of his wartime service or his contribution to fighter tactics. But representatives from the Navy were there, active duty fighter pilots who'd flown combat missions over Iraq and Bosnia, using tactics that traced their lineage back to that July day in 1944, when a farm boy's observation changed the nature of aerial combat. They presented Alice with a folded flag and a plaque commemorating Mack's service. The plaque quoted something Commander McCampbell had written in a fitness report from 1944. Lieutenant McCampbell possesses the rare ability to see beyond established doctrine, to identify tactical innovations that provide significant operational advantage. He is an asset to any command. Alice accepted the honors with quiet dignity, the same quiet dignity with which she'd supported Mack throughout their 50 years of marriage. She knew better than anyone the weight he'd carried, the memories he'd struggled with, the nights when he'd woken from dreams of fire and violence in the sky. But she also knew the man he'd been, in all his complexity, the careful farmer, the loving father, the friend who'd help anyone in need, the veteran who'd done his duty without seeking glory or recognition. That, more than any tactical innovation or military honor, was Mack's real legacy, the example of a life lived with integrity, of duty fulfilled without drama, of service rendered without expectation of reward. The Pacific skies that had been a graveyard in 1944 were peaceful now, crisscrossed by commercial airlines carrying passengers and cargo across the same waters where Mack and his generation had fought. The islands that had been blood-stained battlefields were now tourist destinations, their violent past commemorated in museums and memorials. But the lessons learned in those desperate years remained relevant. The idea that innovation could be as important as courage, that systematic thinking could save lives, that questioning established doctrine wasn't disrespect but rather a necessary part of adaptation and survival. Modern fighter pilots still study the McCampbell defense, though the specifics of the tactic have been updated for jet aircraft and beyond visual range missiles. But the underlying principle remains sound. Create tactical situations where your forces have systematic advantages and leverage those advantages through disciplined execution. It's a simple idea, really. The kind of simple idea that seems obvious in retrospect, but revolutionary when first proposed. The kind of idea that a farm boy from Nebraska might have, approaching a complex problem with clear eyes and systematic thinking. In July 1944, over the waters of the Philippine Sea, that simple idea helped turn the tide of an air war. It saved lives, won battles, and changed the way naval aviators thought about aerial combat. And while James Howard McCampbell never became a household name, never wrote memoirs or gave speeches about his wartime service, his contribution to American military aviation was profound and lasting. The farm boy's trick had worked. The impossible had become doctrine. And in the process, Mack had proven that innovation often comes not from the expected sources, not from the prestigious academies or the brilliant theoreticians, but from ordinary people applying clear thinking to difficult problems. That lesson, perhaps more than any specific tactic or technique, is Mack's enduring legacy. The reminder that anyone, regardless of background or formal education, can contribute to solving the most complex challenges if given the opportunity and the freedom to think creatively. The Pacific skies remember, the naval aviation community remembers, and in a small cemetery in Nebraska, where cornfields stretch to the horizon and the wind carries the smell of good earth, a simple headstone marks the final resting place of a man who changed history without ever seeking to do so. James Howard McCampbell, 1921-1998, farmer, naval aviator, innovator. The farm boy who turned an impossible trick into established doctrine, and in doing so, helped win a war. The story of Mac's contribution didn't end with his passing. In the decades since, military historians and fighter pilots have continued to study and analyze the vertical separation tactic, recognizing it as a key moment in the evolution of air combat doctrine. Modern air forces around the world employ variations of the basic concept, adapted for contemporary aircraft and weapons, but built on the same fundamental principles that Mac identified that night in 1944, sketching diagrams in his notebook while his squadron mates slept. The Pacific skies are quiet now. The violence and terror of 1944 faded into history. But the lessons learned by Mac and his generation continue to echo forward, informing how militaries think about combat, innovation, and the integration of new tactics into established doctrine. In air forces around the world, fighter pilots still learn about the farm boy from Nebraska who saw what others missed, who questioned what others accepted, and who, in doing so, saved countless lives and helped turn the tide of the greatest air war in history. That's the real story of July 1944, of how one young man's observation and systematic thinking transformed aerial combat. It's not a story of superhuman courage or impossible heroics, though those elements were present. It's a story of intelligence applied to problems, of organizations willing to embrace innovation, and of the countless ways that ordinary people, given the opportunity, can achieve extraordinary things. The Pacific skies remember, and so should we.